Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is John Bravender. I'm with the National Weather Service, and want to give you a quick rundown of the GoToWebinar system that we have here. As David's going through his presentation, you'll probably have questions. If you have any questions that come up, you'll be able to type them into the chat window off to the side. If you expand the menu out, there should be a questions box. Type a question in there and it'll come to us, and we'll be able to keep track of those and answer them at the end. And also there's the green raise hand button. You click on that to get our attention as well. We'll be able to allow you to ask any questions at the end. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brad of the Mililani Disaster Readiness Team. Brad, take it away.
Thanks, John. And first of all, I want to thank John for allowing us to use your platform for tonight. Yeah, my name is Brad Sakai. I'm with the Mililani Disaster Preparedness Team. I'd just like to say our team's primary and long-term goal is to develop a Mililani community emergency plan. Our short-term goal right now is to reach as many neighborhoods as possible and encourage them to do three things. And those three things are basically get to know your neighbor, build a disaster kit, and start to strengthen your home. Now, last year I got a chance to see David's brief up at Wheeler Army Airfield, and that was an eye-opener. It was a very powerful brief, and it just complemented John's brief on what we can expect if a hurricane hit Oahu, and it validated the need for us to know your neighbors, because we're going to have to work together and sustain ourselves. And as far as a disaster kit, it just reinforces it has to be a really robust disaster kit, and take those baby steps and strengthen your homes. And that, it'll take years to get a strong home, but we all got to be part of that solution, not add to the problem from a devastating hurricane. So when David briefed us last year, he was the what was he? He was the critical system logistics planner last year, and today he is now the executive officer with a lot more responsibility with the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency. David, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your busy schedule tonight to talk to us. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, David. So thank you.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. And again, John, thanks for this platform. So I'll jump right in. And first off, I'll definitely support Brad and what he's saying. All of those points you made are definitely true. And so hopefully that we can, I guess you could say, make it crystal clear what we're up against with a hurricane, especially on the eve of hurricane or into hurricane season now. So getting started here, back in 2015, we had Vern Miyagi was our administrator, and he started us off with review of plans. And so what we started doing was, of course, reviewing our plans, but really looking at how we would execute them. And what started to become clear is that we need to take a kind of a greater look, or a more in-depth look. And we started interviewing all kinds of people, everybody related to emergency management that we could think of. And what evolved from this is us looking at our vulnerabilities and our emergency management system, I guess you could say, from a more systematic approach. Because before this, we were very siloed in our planning and the way we looked at particular threats, and we didn't really have a good look at the vulnerabilities through the lens of interdependencies and cascading events, and how each system plays or connects with the next system, and what happens when those systems begin to fail. So like I said, we were very siloed. And then what we also learned with this is that people had a very different view of what the damage picture would look like. And so we had to kind of make that more uniform. And this briefing is a result of that, because we had to get everybody on the same, what we call the common operating picture. And that would give us the same starting point for plan development. So what we did was, again, we moved to kind of a what we call a critical systems approach. And we went away from looking at things more or less in the singular. So for instance, if we were looking at a hospital and trying to understand it, we might take in the information of that hospital, but we looked overall at the state's greater medical system. The same thing with shelters. Instead of just looking at emergency shelters, we looked at all the types of shelters, tsunami shelter, post-impact shelters, and then try to do an evaluation of the sheltering system. And so this gives you an idea of some of the systems that we have named and began looking at. We're still trying to get communications completed, wastewater management, and security to add to our vulnerabilities assessment here. You'll see reference there with ports, and as we go through this, you'll start seeing the port become more and more important or more critical as we talk. And so right now, because of the importance of ports and what we want to accomplish with that, it's labeled a little bit bigger over the whole transportation system, because that's kind of where our focus is as far as a priority within the transportation system. So of course, we have to have something to evaluate against, or have factors. And as you saw with those systems, and if you looked at all the people that we talked to, the experts can get very detailed, and the systems are large, complex. So we actually ended up going with littler is better. We looked at these 4 factors and then started measuring and gauging. We found that these 4 factors are common throughout all of the systems, and they do actually give us a good gauge, especially from the emergency management perspective, of when something can fail and what it takes to bring it back online. And that's really, in a nutshell, what we're worried about in emergency management. So as we go through, we'll talk the logistics chain, because of course, we're an island state, and everything has, logistics is a huge part of how we live. Then we'll go on and talk about on-hand supplies, or our operational capacity. And when I say on-hand supplies, understand that on-hand supplies doesn't necessarily mean what we're fully or what the maximum capability of something. We'll talk a little bit about our on-demand economy, and you'll see what I'm talking about there. But on hand, we only measure things of what the average a system keeps on hand to do their normal operation, not their max capacity. So I don't want any confusion there. And then afterward, we have to look, or the next thing we have to look at is our burn rate to critical. Once stress is put on the system, how long is it, excuse me, how long is it going to be able to maintain, or at what point does it start degrading? And then, of course, we have to bring that system back online. So we have to understand its resupply rate, what type of materials or workforce does it need? And of course, some of that might be of how one system connects to another system, where you can't bring it online without that other system. So we try and understand all of these things to make our total assessment. Then we have to base this against our demographics, of course, the population of the state, the people we serve. And for those of you who might have seen this before, you'll notice the middle number 19 is down a little bit, and that's the number of people within the state, or percentage of the population within the state, that would seek emergency shelter. It used to be as high as 35%. So that's really some good news that has been made over the last few years, where we see some improvement in building codes and so forth, greater messaging, where people are less likely to seek shelter. But when you look at that whole bottom left-hand corner, you see basically our vulnerable populations there. When you start adding those numbers up, then we're actually pretty high again. We get up, to 30% or so of our population might need help from the state, and that's a relatively high amount of people that the state would potentially have to take care of in an emergency situation. And then look over to the right, and this is what I call our silent population. That's the tourist industry. And within any 10-day cycle or so in our tourist industry, we might have as high as 15% more of our population entering the state through the tourist industry alone. So again, that's another potential large population that the state has a high probability of taking care of in an emergency environment, because they don't plan to be here for a long time. They don't have long-term living arrangements. Money could be a factor for them, and just their ability to leave after a catastrophic event occurs will probably make them have some type of reliance on the state. So quite a large amount of people we have to take care of. What we try to do is combine all of these elements that I'm talking to you about. We kind of graph them out on a scale. This is a really rough example where you can see some timelines and the colors showing green being good, and then movement toward black, which would be a system that's completely inoperable. But by doing this assessment, we can determine when systems are going to become inoperable or begin to fail. And then, of course, what we have to do to bring them back online, and then predict out when those systems will come back online. I had mentioned interdependencies and cascading effects. And so just to make it clear how this kind of works is that, let's look at power. If we have power and we lose it, most people quickly understand, the lights don't go on, we can't cool things in our refrigerator, the stoplights don't work, and so forth. But a lot of times they don't think any bigger than that. So if we look at the port and understand how important the port is in the middle of the slide, being a major supply point, well, what happens if we lose power to that? Again, most people simply think that, the lights aren't coming on, we're not turning on our computers and so forth. But the port unloads and offloads the biggest container ships through the gantry cranes, which is electric powered. And so if we lose power to the port, then we can't offload our food source. If you think about our food source, everybody in our population, of course, needs our food source. And then we have subsections of our population that during an emergency are going to be a little bit different. For instance, we'll develop a sheltered population, people who are seeking shelter. Well, they have to be fed. So there's an effect of food on that sheltering population. There's our average everyday people who won't be going to work, they need to be fed. And then there's a workforce that needs to be fed. And if people aren't being fed in that workforce, then they're probably not going to work. And if they're not going to work, especially if they have to do with the recovery after a catastrophic event, that means our recovery slows down. When our recovery slows down, we have an extended recovery. That means our systems aren't working correctly, and the bottom line there is that people will continue to die. As an example, that's what happened in Puerto Rico. They had a very long or very extended recovery. And even after a year after Maria hit it, their death toll still rose to about 3,000 people, the majority being long after that storm hit. So that gives you an example of the interdependencies where your systems don't work, and also the cascading effects, the worst case being that we have this extended recovery and people continue to die. This is another diagram, again, trying to show you how we think of things and interconnect them, line them up with the timeline, and understand what systems and how they begin to fail. And so real quick, again, to give you that idea, if we look at our logistics chain, the L in the top left corner, you can see as you move to the port symbol, the second blue symbol where the red line is, if we have a failure there and we lose our ability to ship, every single system relies heavily on the port, and their capacity and ability to function will be greatly reduced if we can't maintain that logistics chain. So again, it gives you another idea of what I mean by interdependencies and cascading of events. So as we move through this, we really have to understand our logistics chain. And the first thing to understand is that we have a very long chain. It's complex. It uses three big modes of transportation: our shipping, our air, and then cross-decking down in the islands to smaller vessels and smaller airplanes to get to our neighbor islands. When we look at our first leg, which is our sea leg, you'll see that we move about 14 million tons of goods in and into the state. They all come in the big containers, and we move about 1.25 million of those big containers a year. And about 1 million tons of that is just food and farm products alone. So quite a bit. And if you think about that, that's about a ton of food and farm products for every person in the state. All of that comes into the Port of Honolulu for the most part, and it gets offloaded at a rate of about 42 containers an hour. And that number will become more important later. The next big leg is our air leg. Our air leg is really good at moving passengers, about 20 million a year or so. But it's not so good at moving cargo. We only do through the air about 1% of our total cargo. We do it at about 4 times the cost of sea freight. So you can see right there with those type of numbers, don't expect a huge expansion of the air to move cargo. It's just not cost effective. Then once everything comes into the state, predominantly both by air and sea comes in to the Port of Honolulu or into HNL. So the big thing here is to consider our location. And we have 2 of our major logistic hubs located on the same island, on the same south shore, within the same 10 or 15 miles. Also with that is other key pieces of infrastructure like oil storage, fuel storage, 1 oil refinery, and offloading mooring point for our fuel at the refinery sites. In very close proximity, we have another harbor, and we have a wastewater treatment plant, all, like I said, within the same 10 or 15 miles. So a lot of key infrastructure, all located in the same area and exposed to the same threats. So something to consider there. Once everything comes into HNL or the Port of Honolulu, it's then cross-decked down to smaller vessels to be dispersed through to our neighbor islands. And once things go intra-island, the big thing to understand here is that we're burning up time as well as material, because those 2 things become important in an emergency. So everything at that point that we use to move goods around the state is from what we call our on-hand resources. So fuel, water, food, any other maintenance needs or requirements to keep this logistics chain going is being burned up from our on-hand supplies, which is critical during an emergency. And then at the end of the day, it takes roughly about 14 days to get through to our furthest ends of our market from the point of origin somewhere on the mainland in the US. So that gives you an idea, quite long supply chain that we're up against. So when we look at that and try to understand that and put it all together from a vulnerability point of view, what this means is that we have a high importation rate, about 90% of our market goods. Very little is produced here within the state. 100% of some of those products, like fuel products, are all imported. Okay, so, and of course, fuel is a high reliability commodity. Long complex chain, we've already talked about that a little bit, but the next thing is that we have to remember is those single points of failure, especially within our port. We don't have the ability to replicate the capability of the Port of Honolulu in any of our commercial ports, whether it be for the depth of the draft or the channel, turnaround basins for the vessels to get in and out, or material handling equipment. None of that can be replicated. And so if we lose the Port of Honolulu, we have to change the whole way we bring in the large quantities, that 14 million tons that we were talking about earlier. We talked a little bit already and understand, I'm sure, about the general locations and exposed to the same threats. And of course, again, about reaffirming the air cargo. Only about 1% of our total cargo importation. And as we go through that, what you're going to see is that air cargo is just not enough to sustain restarting in island state. with our total look at our ports and the logistic and just the movement of food and water to give you an idea of what it takes to keep your shelves normal, we have to move about 3,000 tons of food products a day through our logistics system. And when I say that, I mean that's through the entire system. So it could be being offloaded at the dock on the way to Walmart or Costco, wherever you shop, or it could be, you know, in your car with you taking it home. But in general, if we don't have about 3,000 tons moving that way somewhere in the state through all those pieces, that's when we start looking at our shelves and noticing that they look empty where we shop. That ties directly in with the loss of importation. And what most people don't realize, especially as we roll into hurricane season, is that when there is a large natural disaster threat to the port, whenever possible, the port is closed for protective measures. And during hurricane season, that means that port can close anywhere from 36 to 48 hours prior to, and a really big storm, it might be a little earlier, like 72 hours before landfall. It just depends on the size of the storm and the wind speeds. But what that means for us is that what we have to keep in mind there is that a large storm like that, or a large natural threat, shuts down our port because we go into protective measures. That's when our time starts, because we don't have any more supplies coming in. And in a case like a hurricane, that's before landfall even occurs. And then we also know that when we do get these alerts and warnings about storms, we have a run on the market, so we get a rapid depletion of the market, which, you know, of course, is depletion far above normal. And so you combine that with the closure of the port for protective services, and you see why our shelves become looking very empty very quick. So on-hand resources and our operational capacities, or our operational capacities. So the first two bullets apply to all systems, okay? We have an on-demand warehousing system, and what that means is the whole goal of the people who are doing, you know, our market-based economy is to get things, yes, to a warehouse, but it's to even faster get them out of the warehouse and on the shelves to be sold, because it costs money for them to keep them in a warehouse. And so we don't have this big built up surplus in our warehouses of commodities waiting to be moved to market. Everything is moved to market very rapidly once it's offloaded, and even if it's pushed to a warehouse for a quick storage, it's basically just to offer a little bit of protection before the vendor can move it quickly to the market to be sold. Okay, and so what that means for us in an emergency is that we don't have any warehousing of supplies. There's no emergency surplus. When things hit here, we have what we have. And for food and water, that means, depending on when our last shipment was, assuming it was today or yesterday, we have roughly 5 to 7 days in the state after that port closes. And to give you an idea how quickly it goes, after 5 days with loss of importation, nothing coming in, we've lost about 40% of our market capacity. It's all bought out, it's gone. And of that 40%, or whatever's left on the shelves, that also in that count includes paper towels, napkins, paper plates, other, you know, condiments and things like that. So that 40% in actual food goods might be a little less than that. Our emergency shelter system, the bottom line here is the supply can't meet the demand. We have a limited number of hardened shelters, and probably is not going to get any better in the near future. It's very expensive to retrofit buildings to meet hurricane standards, and it takes a long time. So the shelter supply through existing buildings is a very slow process. Probably the only real increase is expand to, as new buildings are built, raise the standards to a higher level building code or protection with the intention of them serving as shelters. Our medical system is roughly 3 days of general supplies. This is probably the best stock system. That 3 days includes fuel for generators, food and water for staff and patients, roughly about 7 days of pharmaceuticals throughout the state. But where we're kind of hurting or more vulnerable in our medical arena is with the workforce. There's a shortage of medical professionals. One study showed almost 700 medical doctor positions open across the state. So our medical professional shortage adds to our medical vulnerability, as well as operating at a high, our hospitals and medical facilities operate at very high capacity. They operate almost at about 90% full most of the time. And when you put those two vulnerability factors together for our hospital system or medical system, means that our ability to quickly handle mass casualties is at risk, okay? And of course, if you think about it, with COVID-19 happening, that was the biggest fear, is that our hospitals become overwhelmed. Our fuel, we have several single points in our fuel system. The biggest is, again, we have to import everything. We're down to one oil refinery now. The offshore mooring point is, we have 2 of them, but they're basically located in the same place, and they come ashore at the same place at the refinery. It's the only way that we can offload fuel massively from the large tankers. We can't do that at any other commercial port. All the fuel has to be cross-decked down to tanker barges and moved that way. So again, very limiting in what we can bring in mass through our fuel supply system. Electricity. The big thing here is that we don't have mutually supporting systems. And what this means is that if Maui power goes down, we can't flip a switch on Oahu and deliver power to Maui. Each system works independently and has to come up on its own. The other big factor is about 60% of our power plants are in inundation zones. And like every other major industry component in all of our systems, they have very limited inventories. So again, the ability to massively come online is greatly hindered because of a low inventory of components. Our port system, our transportation, in specific our ports, is that we don't have any large scale dredging equipment. We would have to order out for that. It takes roughly 7 to 10 days for that to get in. That's assuming that we can line up a vendor, get him to set sail right away and get to the port and start working. We do have an alternate port concept. Some of you might have heard of it being Pearl Harbor, but it's not fully realized yet. Still a lot of work that needs to happen to make that a truly viable option. And of course, we have the airports, roughly 4 days of fuel, maybe as high as 7 without refueling, depending on where each island is in their fuel system, in their fuel cycle. And the bottom line here, again, with the airport, is that we have really a low cargo capacity versus emergency delivery. So that's the things to keep in mind there. Okay, so usually about this time, we usually get a lot of questions about hurricanes. In a sense, I know John's given you some ideas with his briefing. But what the big question that we usually get is this: one of these storms won't affect the whole state. And so what I wanted to show you is Hurricane Katrina, to give you an idea of the size and power of these storms. This is Hurricane Katrina. Of course, it went ashore around New Orleans. And when we first started giving this brief, we got a lot of pushback from using that as an example, because everyone said, well, that's the 1 in a million storm. So That's kind of the outlier. So what we did was, instead of looking at New Orleans, we looked at the whole coast of Mississippi, which is roughly 125 miles across and contains 3 ports, very similar to size and capacity and throughput as the port of Honolulu. And what we found out is that although Hurricane Katrina didn't hit the Mississippi Gulf Coast head on, it went further to the west. What we did learn, though, was that even though the port went into protective measures, it still was hit with enough force to do damage to all its major systems, and enough damage that even 4 months after the storm, they were still only at about 30% of their operational capacity. And remember, the port, Mississippi has the whole interstate system of the United States to bring and deliver material and workforce, as well as the other pieces of shipping of the Gulf Coast, where things can get moved very rapidly to Mississippi to help them recover. Of course, Hawaii doesn't have that. So when you look at Hawaii, and this is as close as to scale as I could possibly get, you see the gold dot, of course, is the South Shore of Oahu, that, as I already explained, contains a lot of state infrastructure. But look at the eye of the storm in comparison to Oahu. The eye of the storm is bigger than Oahu. And if you look at the boundaries of the storm, you can see they easily encompass the whole state. So these storms are big, they're powerful, and they can easily encompass, one storm can easily encompass and affect our whole state. And this chart is a quick look. It comes from the after action review of Hurricane Katrina from the Mississippi Gulf ports. And you can see in the second row describes their decline in tonnage, even 4 months after the storm. So it's amazing the amount of damage. And if you look at the cost damage assessment, incredible amounts of money that it's going to take to go in and repair. Also take a quick look at the above the damage to the types of damage. And if you look across there, you can see just about every system that would keep a port running was destroyed on all 3 of these ports. So again, very critical in the protection of our port. So burn rate to critical. So what happens once stress is put on our systems? The top 2 bullets apply again to all the systems as we go through them. So like we talked about, because the on-demand economy, we don't have any long-term surplus of materials. That includes spare equipment, workforce, and things like that. So most agencies and most companies who we've talked to who really do some good COOP planning and this hurricane planning or other emergency planning use a planning factor of about a 30% loss of their workforce. And then there's always runs of emergency goods before and of course after, as soon as things can open up and people can start moving around. Again, we see this depletion of supplies above normal rates, which especially in an island state with limited surplus means it goes very fast. There's not a lot of material to do the things that we need to do. So food and water, we've already mentioned, we're at critical levels within 5 days. Now FEMA does have 420,000 emergency rations for us. But what you have to understand is that those rations aren't just for Hawaii, they're for the whole Pacific region. They've seen this brief, they're actually raising that number. But the thing to understand here is because of building construction and types of construction, the differences in building codes, and especially in our residential areas where we still have a large percentage of our population in single wall construction, homes on tofu blocks, that with a category 3 hurricane and above, that starts being very critical. So you can expect a displacement of people in a Katrina-like storm up to 300, between 300 and 700,000 of our population would be displaced. And so you can see the emergency rations of 420,000, although it might have sounded like a lot in the beginning, when you're putting that up against 300 to 700,000 people who be displaced, it's not very much. We talked already about rapid depletion of the market inventory. So what I'll point out here is, again, how fast things go. We did studies in 2000, from 2015 on, about the market and its depletion using storms as they would come through, and we would poll vendors and try to understand their market inventory. And what we learned was, once a storm warning comes, that of course there's this run on the market. But to give you an idea how fast, one of the largest vendors in the state, in 24 hours shipped out 500,000 gallons of water to the neighbor islands, and that emptied their warehouse. And so of course that means there's no other water to be delivered until that port opens back up again. So that gives you an idea how quick it goes and how much goes. All, basically all in a day. It can all be pushed out, and then there's no surplus. Our shelter system, we expect critical levels on impact. As I already explained to you, that we don't have enough to go around, so there's overcrowding. Also, I mentioned that there are very few hardened shelters, because for the longest period of time, the only method used to increase shelter space was the retrofit program that was designed to retrofit Department of Education buildings or schools to a certain hurricane standard. And like I was telling you, it takes a lot of money and a long period of time to make these retrofits happen. So we would expect overcrowding, and we would even expect failed shelter structures. And so what that also ties into is post-event, because now we're displacing people from damaged shelters into already crowded shelters, and then post-event, now damaged buildings or buildings that might have been used for sheltering can't be for the long term. So again, rough on our sheltering system. Also too, because the sheltering system for so long, or the focus in sheltering for so long within the state, was on trying to retrofit buildings, no other focus was really put on the overall sheltering system, meaning workforce, supplying shelters, first aid for shelters, and things like this. And so we're actually lagging behind where we would like to be with the support it takes to run a sheltering program throughout the state, especially post-event. So we're behind there as well. Medical, as I was telling you, roughly 3 days in their surplus. They also, medical people though, have done a pretty good amount of training and understanding this. They're expecting a 6-time patient increase. That actually came from Iniki, so those are some good local numbers for us as planning factors. And they also plan to reduce their general medical services by about 40%. So that gives you an idea. They're already thinking about it and have plans about doing that to balance the idea of their workforce shortage and their high operational capacity during normal times. Fuel, we would expect all the single points of failure to fail. That would mean inter-island shortages probably somewhere around day 14, depending, of course, on each island's a little bit different because of their refueling cycle. But the other thing that we learned was that there's a high expectation of contamination or ruptures of our fuel tanks. Most of our fuel tanks our fuel farms are in inundation zones. And also most of our fuel farms were built at a time where the only requirement was for them to be gravity anchored, which means you just fill in enough volume in the tank with whatever liquid you're holding or water, and then the weight of the volume keeps the tank from floating. So of course, that costs money, and so who knows really what's going to float, what's not. Also, we found out too that, there's berms around the fuel farm. Those containment berms are designed to hold fuel in, not necessarily to keep water out. And so when you have water trying to get in, that creates pressure on those walls that wasn't designed for, and so the walls begin to deteriorate. So you might not only have inundation in your fuel farm and floating tanks, but then if there was a spill or a ruptured tank, there's not going to be any containment. And so now you're doing recovery and restoration operations in a hazmat environment, which definitely increases the amount of time it takes to recover. Electricity. We expect critical levels on impact. What didn't completely go down, we would expect, that there would be fluctuating power supply, and that would continue. Could continue for months, depending on when the systems can come up and when people can be brought on island to do repairs. We have a very long T&D system, and we would expect there'd be several failures along that. And the T&D system is transfer and delivery, which is basically our overhead lines. The state has about 7,000 miles of overhead lines, so you can imagine trying to track down power problems throughout 7,000 miles of lines. It's quite difficult and time consuming. The other issue with that T&D system is we have overall in the state a very high wood pole inventory. And so combine the length of the lines with the wood pole inventory, and we have a T&D system that's highly vulnerable to wind events. Now, HECO and the electric industry does have emergency compacts with the West Coast, and they're very good compacts that will get help here, equipment, manpower, and help to the state. The issue though is that they're very large support packages, and so that means you have to have open logistics chain to move these massive amounts of trucks, machinery, telephone poles, other components that that you might need for a complete grid restoration. And so that requires the port to be open. So many of those things aren't going to start happening until the port opens up. And then when we do look at our ports, we see a high possibility. Our maritime experts tell us that it's a very high probability of port closure due to channel blockage, either because of material or siltage or a vessel going down within the port that would block the channel. There's only one way in, one way out of our port. It's a very narrow entry mouth or channel mouth, only about 500 feet across. And so again, highly vulnerable to problems that might occur, or an accident might occur, or other debris from a storm that might fill in the basin. So we would expect there would be failure on impact if any of those things happen. We would try to move to an alternate port system, but the alternate port system only provides about 1/5 of the throughput. It unloads only one ship at a time. The offload capacity would be about 8 to 10 containers an hour, which would take about 3 days. And if you remember in the beginning of the presentation, I told you normal operations was about 42 containers an hour. So that gives you an idea of the reduction of throughput we would have after a storm, when we'd have an increased amount of work and the requirement for an increased amount of material. This gives you an idea of some affected piers that we would have to kind of add to the vulnerability of our port. We had a survey done, it was in 2017, I believe, that looked at inundation over the port. And what we learned was that it only takes about 1 meter of water to start bringing about the greatest amount of damage to our port. And 1 meter of water could be in a large like a Lucian earthquake could send a tsunami down that would do that, or a strong Category 3 hurricane could push 1 meter of water into the harbor to start creating this damage. If you see and look at all of the red spaces are our major dock areas, especially 51 and 52. And you can see that the red indicates major to complete damage if that would happen. So again, kind of an aging infrastructure creates a lot of risk. So what's it take to bring things back? Again, the first two bullets apply to all the systems. We have to realize right off that we have an increased workload, but plan on a reduced workforce. So that means everything that we did during normal times is going to take quite a bit longer after or post catastrophic event. There's also what most people don't realize, there's two restorative considerations that happen post event. And the first one is we have a daily operational demand. There are certain things that we are going to want to do, you know, life safety, perform search and rescue. And then as that transitions, daily operations might be trying to take care of a bridge, things like this. But no matter what those daily operations are, is that we're going to need the workforce and material to get those done. We rely on our logistics system to do that. But if we don't plan ahead and start trying to really understand the priorities and what needs to be built, then we're not doing any replenishment planning and bringing any material or workforce in to consider trying to get back to the normal levels. And that's imperative, because if we don't do that, and we don't put all this information we're talking about to work, then every day is just an emergency. And then we start getting into this extended recovery, much like I was explaining to you about PR and Maria in the beginning of the presentation. And that's what we're trying to avoid here. And what we learned in our logistics rate was that for every day the port's closed, and this is simply a port closure due to protection. And we did a measurement on this, like I was telling you, in our studies of other storms as they would approach. But just in port closure, once we closed the port, we found out that for every day that port's closed, it takes 5 days of normal port operations to restore inventory levels at the furthest end of our state. And so that gives you an idea of what it takes. So, you know, think about it, 5 days of port being down, that means roughly 25 days at the furthest end of our state that there's going to be a lack of material getting there. For food and water, when we look at that loss of port, that would mean that we would probably be at a hand-to-mouth resupply for about 30 days. And we could keep that expectation of severe shortage in our food system until the port reopens. Okay, and when I say hand-to-mouth resupply, what that means is that by whatever means we can, we're going to supply food and bring it in, disperse it to the population, and then the population will probably consume it almost immediately, and then just be waiting for the next resupply. Our shelter system, as I was explaining to you earlier, is that our shelter system long-term doesn't have a great support package built into it as of yet, and we would expect them to feel the same stress as the general population. Probably the only thing here that would really help out overall is probably a lot of our citizens would try to move back home or move in with auntie and uncle until, you know, their home could get fixed, or they could find a place, or live under the blue roof. And so probably after 10 or 15 days of sheltering being open, probably what would be left in our shelter, the people who have truly lost everything and don't have anything to go, vulnerable populations, and probably tourists who are trying to get out and have lost hotel space and things like that, can't pay for a hotel, or got caught at the airport, this type of thing. Our medical system, we expect about the same hand-to-mouth resupply for 30 days or so. The medical field and hospitals do have a pretty good plan about workforce reduction, going 30 or 45 days of how long they would plan out their workforce reduction schedules and so forth. And we talked earlier about some of their reduction of services, and it would be things like outpatient services. They predict, 80, 90% of their outpatient services and things like that would be either reduced or completely stopped, so that they could take care of the higher medical needs of the communities. Our fuel, as we were talking about, we're down to about one refinery, or we're down to one refinery right now. All our major fuel has to come in through there. And so until that would open up, we would probably be trying to resupply directly in with smaller vessels into our major or into our other commercial ports. And we would expect our shortages to continue until that offshore mooring point was established again and could pump to the refinery. The refinery could probably take in refined fuel and then just deliver straight out from there, but that would come at a high price to bring in refined fuel versus having the refinery up and running and refine crude for us. Our electricity, you'd expect some circuits to come up, but power plants in general have the potential for being down for months. There's also, as I was mentioning before, all of these big industry components in our electric, in our fuel production, in our shipping, the gantry cranes and things like that. All of these big scale components that help these large industries work, these components might not all be manufactured in the United States. And so in some cases, just during normal times, it might take 9 weeks to get a component that has to be ordered from Norway or Germany or a place like that. And the other problem is not only the availability of a component, but marrying up the workforce or the expertise to put that in. Because if it wasn't built and a continued installation required here in the state, then probably that expertise doesn't reside in the state. And so you have to marry up the expertise and the component, get it here under this stressed emergency environment, and before you can get both of those things together in here, that system may not come up. When we look at ports, all things going our way, we can locate a vendor, we can get big salvage out here or big dredging out here. We would look at somewhere around day 19 that equipment to arrive here, and actually probably day 20, 21, maybe 22 before it starts actually operating. But remember what I was explaining to you when we looked at Mississippi, that port restoration is kind of a long, in a sense, flat process to get a port up and running. So just because the port might be open and can accept a ship or two doesn't mean that it's going to be operating at full capacity. It might take some time to do that. All things being probably very hopeful, we would reach that somewhere between 30 and 45 days, get upward of 75 to 100% of our operational capacity. If we could locate that dredging vendor quickly. H&L restores about one runway every 3 days. So by day 12, we would have an increase in our air power, but that would probably be limited by other factors. So it would probably not be commercial air the way we think of it. It would probably be air power, probably by the military first, large cargo craft, probably only during daylight hours, and what they call day VFR, visual flight rules. And so you have limited time flying, limited amount of aircraft that will be flying in our material. The bottom line here, and after, if we have time or if people want to hear, we have a little bit of information about what happened with Puerto Rico, but the bottom line here is based on lessons from Hurricane Maria. What we've always said is that air power is not going to have the capacity to relieve the stress on all our systems, and PR and Maria definitely proved that. So it's really important for us to get that port up. So what I'll do right now is I'll open to some questions about the material that I just gave you. And then if we have a few more minutes, then I'll speak to Puerto Rico.
Great, thank you very much, David. We do have a couple of questions come in. One of them was early on, talking about focus on utility poles. I know you had mentioned a few different times about the length of the utility lines that we have. The question is, has there, I guess to rephrase it slightly, any work to preemptively replace some of those wooden poles before they would be damaged and need to be shipped in emergency conditions?
So yes, HECO has done some upgrades on poles and other pieces of their power infrastructure. But again, you know, the nature of economy and power here is probably limiting a lot of that with the amount, because it's quite a bit more expensive to put up, you know, concrete or reinforced poles. And then when you look at the amount, that of course the end result is driving electric prices up. So it's probably been on a limited version and or a limited basis. And I've not heard of any kind of large scale plan, like to say with a milestone and a percentage of reinforcement or underground cable movement and so on and so forth. So there is improvement projects, but they're on a limited basis and probably not happening as fast as we would like them.
Okay, we've also had a couple questions related to the presentation. One, whether they can get a copy of the slides and whether it will be available later on.
So it depends on, in general, we usually brief this to emergency management people or stakeholders. So we usually don't provide to general public this, but depending on who they are and what agency or organization, we can definitely see what can be made available to people.
All right, that looks, if you have any more questions, please type them in.
Well, then, if we have time, John, I can go ahead and take about 5 more minutes. I'll hit kind of the comparison of PR, and then again, if there's any questions, we can, if not, we can close out.
Sounds good.
Okay. So when we look at what happened with PR, one of the things we have to understand with Maria, and with the brief that I just gave. So the brief that I just gave you was basically what happens when only one catastrophic event occurs. Unfortunately, what happened with PR, there was actually 2. You know, the Irma came first, very powerful storm that started weakening Puerto Rico's systems. And then Maria hit, and you know, that was another really big storm, moved, I guess you would say, a little bit slower than they probably would have liked across the island. And so the hurricane force winds reached there a couple days prior to impact. And so on any wind vulnerable systems, they started feeling effects long before the storm got there. And then with the slow movement of it, or the spin down, it was upward 5 days before they could actually start trying to go into recovery. They were mostly worried about saving people's lives for those first 5 days afterward. So they had a delayed time where they could actually get out and work. Now, having said that, what we see is some evidence of non-mutually supporting plans. And again, siloed non-systematic planning and learning that these systems today need other systems to function. They don't function independently. They also didn't have a good grasp on their requirements and didn't have a lot of understanding about what their workforce was going to do, which, as if anyone followed it, they realized that, especially in their transportation system, that their workforce didn't show up. So they didn't have a means to move debris, you know, the equipment operators and the drivers and things to move the trucks and cargo. So really big hit on their logistics system. So when we look at logistics, they had some clogging at ports because of the things that I just described. They, like us, they are an on-demand economy, island state, so they don't have a large emergency surplus built up. And so when you look at that, and not understanding their workforce, these numbers come for what the federal government put into PR in the first 38 to 45 days. And as you can see, they dumped an incredible amount of personnel in there because their workforce wasn't showing up, and they needed people to do these jobs that normal recovery people and normal emergency management people would be doing. As you can see, they used a lot of high density items, planes, helicopters, cutters. And because their transportation system wasn't working the way it should, they didn't understand these interdependencies and how one system affects the other. They had to resort to over 700 airdrops just to deliver their emergency materials. Then when we had mentioned too about the rates of food, or the amounts of just food product. And to give you an idea of what they brought in the first 38 days or so, it's just an incredible amount of, you know, over 1 million tons of water per day, and, you know, almost, well, about 500,000 tons of food per day. Remember what we said, takes roughly, for what we're used to taking in, is about 3,000 tons a day for normal operations. So you can see the incredible amount that it takes to start bringing an island state back online. It's just an incredible amount of material. These numbers alone makes what they did in our port about 500 times our normal rate that we would have to push through a day to equal the same type of delivery. The other thing that I mentioned was debris management, and debris management's a huge piece of recovery. Again, they didn't have a good connection of how debris management was going to work and support their transportation system, opening the ports and opening other major arteries. And they identified in those first 40 days or so about 6.2 million cubic yards. And so imagine 7 Yankee stadiums filled with debris, but strewn across our islands. And that gives you an idea of how much debris a major storm like that can bring. All of that debris has to be pushed out of road space and lay down space, and because, especially with the island state, space is a premium, and we're going to need every inch of that to open those arteries and put material that's coming in, because the amount of material, again, it's phenomenal what it takes to bring back systems. So they had a hand-to-mouth resupply on impact. Although their grocery stores were open, again, their transportation system wasn't working correctly. And so in understanding those massive amounts of water that I was talking to you about, again, the numbers, you see them there, but what those numbers are, if you look in the right-hand side, when we adjust those numbers for our population, you can see that we're basically getting just a few meals per day and a liter or so of water for people, you know, every 3 days or so. And so basically what we're talking about here is just enough food to keep people alive. You're not getting a lot of work done on this amount of food. So again, it takes a lot of material to come in and restart things basically back from zero. And that's again what a lot of people forget about this, is that in an island state we have a chance to run the risk of losing everything if something hits us really hard. Our shelter system, or the PR shelter system, they did a great job opening shelters, over 500 or so open. But again, understanding the interdependencies, they have dams just like we do. A particular region has had quite a few dams, and they didn't execute their dam inspection program just like what we have. They didn't execute it properly. They didn't have faith or confidence that their dams were going to hold, especially as the storm or the weather system slowed down and dumped more water on them. And so what they ended up doing is evacuating a region of about 70,000 people. Of course, most of them went into shelters. So you're overburdening your shelter system, and then you have to take care of 70,000 more people from an emergency management standpoint, because you didn't conduct good dam inspections when it was fair weather. So again, understanding the interdependencies, having mutually supporting plans, and understanding the cascading effects of your systems. Their medical system, yeah, lots of problems there too. A lot of medical help was deployed from the state. But the big point I want to show you is when you look at plus 8 days, so still after 8 days, only 70% of their hospitals, they were inoperable. Okay, so not a high number of hospitals working. And then also the last phrase there, status of 8 hospitals unknown. So again, no communications plan. You have a huge life-saving piece or system that you don't, you can't, from emergency management perspective, you have inoperable, 70% of that system's inoperable, and 8 of those hospitals you don't even know the status to. And similarly, on the back end of that, the medical side, the hospital side, didn't have good planning to come back online. They didn't have a good communication plan to talk with the EOC to let them know what they need or what their status was. So big lesson learned there. Fuel, they had fuel, but they didn't have ground support to deliver it. And they had gas stations that could open, but couldn't get the fuel there. So again, showing the interconnectivity between systems and understanding the effect that the effect of those cascading events as systems fail or can't come back up. Electricity, like us, they have an aging infrastructure. Their system was already under stress because of the first storm. And again, similarly like us, they have a mountain range where power is generated on one side of that mountain range. The lines travel over the mountain range to the more populated side of the island. So they lost their systems. They're still having power problems there. Another big learning point here is that, overall you have to invest in your electric system. Their power system was taken over by the state. It became basically a state-run business. They didn't do a lot of investment in it. So it was, like I said, aging infrastructure with little investment in it. So its chance of survivability, again, decreases. The other problem with that is knowing what you have and how to plan for it. And they had no contingency contracts with vendors who could do the work on the system they had. And so what happened is that they did contract with a vendor who claimed he could do the work, but he had not been vetted because of other financial issues with their government. They had to deal with this contractor in basically a cash basis. They paid him, $1 million or so. He came in, he didn't perform the work correctly, and actually caused some damage again to their system. So not only did they lose the money, but this vendor, this contractor set their system back. And like I said, even today, they're still having some outages and they're not back up to full power. Communication, lost about 90% of their cellular structure on impact. But after about 11 days, they recovered about a third of their cell service. And then I think it was about 40 days, they were up to about 90%. And this is a great example of making sure that emergency management gets with private industry experts, because it was private industry that came in and got their cell system back up and running, not the government. So again, really good example in that, having some private partnerships with industry experts that can help bring up emergency management systems and aid emergency management with recovery. Their ports, again, they didn't receive a lot of damage, but what it does show us is that again, port reopening is kind of a long, flat process. Even though they didn't receive a lot of damage going through the assessment and ensuring that the port was good to open, no port opened up at a 100%. They all opened with restrictions. The least was San Juan with that 3 days, and Mayagüez was at 7. Their airports did open relatively quickly also, but it was as we predicted with ours, is that they opened with military transport first. It was day VFR flights, so limited flights. And again, trying to show you the amounts of food, especially food and water products that come in, is even though they got their planes or their airports open, and the amount of food or meals that still came in was only on average about 100,000 per day. So again, it shows you that air power, there's just not enough capacity for air power to help really. I mean, it will help in restoration, but we're not going to see a rapid gain in bringing our systems back online through just air power. And then also, to give you an idea along that same line, is the fuel. And you can see they brought in what appears to be a lot of fuel, 3.6 million gallons, right? But for Hawaii during normal time, that's only about 7 days of fuel. That's how much we drive. So even though it sounds like a lot, when you start putting it into use and how this would be dispersed, it doesn't go a long way. It takes an incredible amount of material to bring us back to what we would call normal. So I'll close with this. This is what I call our sphere support. And so you can see San Juan, and you can see basically the center, geographic center of our state. And if we reach out to our nearest point on the west coast, we have this circle, and equidistance from San Juan, the same circle. And you can see their sphere of support is much greater. They have the whole eastern seaboard and the transportation capability of our interstates, our railheads that can move products to the seaports. And then we have such a long, and the Gulf Coast, and major shipping that can move things to San Juan, not to mention Central and South America there, whereas we're way out in the middle, of course, of nowhere. So our sphere support is very limited. And so, in understanding that, we think about what PR went through and what we might have to face if we get a Maria-like storm. So that's that's all I have. I'll open it for questions and turn it back over to you, John.
So we actually have a couple more questions that have come in.
Sure.
Sounds like triggered by the question about the debris management. Do we have the counties developed debris management plans and debris reduction and storage sites in our islands?
So that's a good question. We are actually running workshops. We did last year as well, and we're doing it again this year because we didn't get as far as we would have liked to last year. The counties are working on these type of plans. I will say though, in all honesty, they're in their infancy. The same with the state plans. None of these have been developed in the manner in which we would have liked to seen or would want. And so we are trying to improve not only the planning and the detail of the planning, but how our plans fit together with the county, because we have different jobs. And so like I said, there's an ongoing project to do this. We would have liked to got a lot further this year, but unfortunately we had COVID. So the plans aren't where we want to be, but we are working on them. They are on the priority list. Ports, debris management, and logistics or material distribution are our big priorities.
So actually that kind of ties into another question that we have related to the state's catastrophic hurricane plan. How do those plans all tie together with that?
So that's another good question. So we do have the catastrophic hurricane plan. We are doing small revisions to that and trying to improve it a bit. However, we would probably in the next few years see a transition from the idea of a catastrophic hurricane plan to a more comprehensive emergency management planning document that would incorporate things based on not so much like a hurricane plan, but a catastrophic events, multi or all hazard, and then with various task-oriented plans, and each plan developed in the sense of, is somebody doing the task or supporting the task, meaning the jurisdiction. And therefore we would have better detailed plans to making sure a specific task is done, and then as well as how it would be supported. And so we're going about kind of changing the philosophy from just a catastrophic idea of a catastrophic event to an all hazard, because there are certain things when you look at all hazard or a variety of hazards, when you apply the damage that's done on the system, in a sense, it doesn't matter what caused it. The damage is done and you have to bring it back up. So what I'm getting at is there's many commonalities that occur to systems despite whatever hazard you're applying to it. And so we're looking at those commonalities and saying, what tasks do we have to do across the board, no matter what damage is done by a specific hazard.
Also looks like we have I guess more of a general question. Is there a general level of mitigation speed bumps that you expect caused by COVID-19 in terms of recovery, return to restoration time, things like that?
So I yeah, so that's kind of I mean, yes and no. So for instance, I know there's a lot of things going on with COVID-19, but really because of the disease medically right now, we're not really stressed. Our hospital populations are down and things like that. So if we get hit by a catastrophic event, we're not in bad shape because of COVID-19. None of our systems are damaged, nothing's destroyed. And so in that respect, we're okay. We might have some problems with sheltering because of COVID-19, but after that, it's mostly, you go to work with a mask today. After the event, you're going to go to work with a mask. So in that respect, no. Now it'd be different if we have huge huge COVID-19 problems, like with hospitals overflow and this, big sickness going on. But we don't have that right now. And so I think as things are now, we're kind of getting back to business as normal, and our recovery would probably remain that way too.
Okay, let's go for one more. Clem, I see you have your hand raised. I've just unmuted you. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, this is addressed to David. You didn't talk, I know you mentioned about communications, and you haven't done an assessment on that yet. That's one of the things you plan to do. When do you plan to do the communication assessment?
That's a good question. How are you, Clem? That's a good question. As soon as you can get the legislature to get me some more money and people. So we don't have the people and personnel to do the operations we're doing, especially under COVID-19, because we're answering a basic response there. So we just don't have the people to move as fast as we would like.
Okay, the other comment
probably very similar to the counties as well. I know that they probably don't have enough people to move as fast as they would like either.
Yeah, the other comment is, and when you do the communication plan, hopefully you look at amateur radio as part of that plan too.
Yeah, so there's two aspects to communications plan. There's the emergency communications aspect, which amateur radio would more fall into, and then there's the aspect of restoring communications to the public, which is a different animal. So there's two aspects of looking at communications.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So cool. We've taken more of David's time than we had, I think, planned for. Thank you very much. We certainly appreciate you going through all this information.
No problem, John. I'll send you my bill tomorrow. Thanks for having us. We're glad to be able to get some information out.
Brad, would you like to say any closing remarks?
Hey, John. Yeah, I would. First of all, what an outstanding brief, David.
Thank you, sir.
First John's brief, followed by yours. It's a great brief. Back in 2017, when those 3 hurricanes hit the mainland, that's when we decided to put this Mid-Atlantic Disaster Preparedness Team together. And I was talking to my dad, who's a senior citizen. I'm a senior citizen too, but I'm a young senior citizen. And he told me, "Hey, Brad, be careful now. Don't scare people." And the sky's not falling. I realize that, and it would be a rare event for Oahu to get a direct hit. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it would be a rare event. But I'm always in the mindset of planning for the worst and hoping for the best kind of scenario. And when I hear briefs from John and David, and in the area where I can control is my neighbors. I don't control my neighbors, but I can make friends with my neighbors and get to know them, and then say, you know what, we need to pull together, because I was hoping that a community as Mililani could do that also, but it's hard to get that momentum moving right now in Mililani. Yeah. So now as the neighborhood's coming together, it's like, okay, how can I help you, neighbor, to get your disaster kit together, help you with your house, do whatever can I do to help you, because I'm doing the same for my family, and if a hurricane hits us, there's only so much aloha can go around. I can't give food to everybody, so I'm trying to make sure that we're all working together to sustain ourselves. Because if I remember correctly, David, that 14 days food and water, that is when you shut down the ports, and then when you crank it back up with nothing happening to the ports, it takes 14 days to get food and water back on the shelves. But any damage to those ports, that 14-day food water is out the window. It starts to increase. So we have to be able to sustain ourselves in a neighborhood together as a family. And if we don't do that, people are going to start panicking. And my next concern is civil disorder. Yeah. And that's probably another topic. So that down the road here. But again, the brief was an outstanding brief. I hope everybody got the big picture, why we got to start working together as neighbors, helping each other. And if I misspoke, David or John, please let me know.
No, yeah, and you said a lot just in that last piece. I mean, you're absolutely right. So, real quick, you know, people have to understand you got to participate in your own rescue here, and that's what we're talking about. Survivability, and it comes from surplus basically, and strengthening where you live. And if you think about it, you know, especially you know, Brad, people our age and so forth. You know, when we were young, it was fairly new to talk about fire prevention in homes, and they did it in the schools. And so it's an education process is what I'm getting at. And so the more people we can educate about these risks, like you said, the sky's not falling. It's common sense looking at threats that exist because of the place we live and what happens. It's common sense stuff. And the more you know about it, the more you understand about it, the more you can do to protect yourself, your family, others, and you're in less fear too. So I think, you know, all of these things kind of go hand in hand. Yeah, so that's, you're right about the other points too, with the amount of food you have to have. And again, it goes back to what I was saying about surplus. So that's true. And then lastly, your point about civil unrest, that's, you know, definitely a threat or a worry. And if you look across the world, I know some of you know what I used to do, so I can tell you I've been some bad places, and with people who have a lot less things than we have, and it doesn't take a lot to bring out the worst in mankind. And we actually saw it in Katrina. So you can go back and look at history just in our backyard, and you can see where this type of disaster can have some negative results on the population, but the greater we can educate people about what to expect, we reduce the chance of those negative behaviors.
Well, John and David, that's all I really have to say. You guys did a great job this past couple of weeks, so thank you so much for allowing me to use your platform, John and David.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. By the way,
this is recorded. It's available to the public, correct?
Yep, we've got it recorded, and we'll post it on the Weather Service YouTube page, and send out the link to you and the attendees for reference if they want to view it again in the future.
Sir, thank you so much, guys. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you. We appreciate it.
Have a good evening. Thank you, folks.
Yes, sir. Thanks.
Right. Thanks. Have a good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Aloha.
Aloha.